Well, hello there, Chowie Hills. Welcome once again to another Bible Fellowship video here on our YouTube channel. Coming to you today from my office, and I'm just real grateful that you have chosen to tune in again for another episode, if you will. We are coming to the very last session or the last lesson of this unit, and we've been talking about emotions, when emotions rise. And at the risk of sounding redundant, but maybe you haven't been paying attention to the videos, maybe this is your first one in a while, but we've been really talking about this idea that emotions are a part of life. They do go up and down, but we really need to understand how we control them, how we respond to those things, even though they are realities. It's a part of life, and yet the Bible gives us some clear ways to deal with those things. And what we've been looking at, and it's especially important as we get to this last particular topic, but we've been looking at the fact that God's Word provides answers for us, and we really need to stress moving ourselves past this sort of Pollyanna viewpoint that, oh, God will take care of everything, because there are struggles in our lives, and as we said before, emotions are real, but really moving past that, but never losing sight of the fact that God really is in control, that spirit-filled living and living according to His Word and in obedience and putting our trust and reliance upon Him, those are answers to the issues that we have going on. And it may be more vitally important for this one than any we've looked at before. And so we're looking today at this emotion of depression, this idea of sadness, or kind of an overwhelming sense of feeling the blues, feeling blasé, kind of a lackadaisical attitude. And so what we really want to stress, though, even before we get into some discussion, and we're going to be looking at the book of Psalms again. Psalm 31 is what we're going to be looking at today, if you want to turn there. But we want to make sure that you understand we're not talking here about a diagnosable condition. We're not talking about clinical depression. We never want to minimize that. Clinical depression is real. There are physiological reasons oftentimes. There are other circumstances that lead us to actual clinical depression. Again, where that can be diagnosed, where we need medical care, where we need trained counseling. Many times the depression might stem from just the fact that the synapses in the brain aren't working properly, or whatever, some other physiological reason where we can take medicine for that would alleviate that. And there should be no shame in that. If we've got a physical ailment where something in our body isn't working, but a medicine can bridge that gap or bring some healing or some relief, we should find no shame in the fact that if there's a physiological reason for depression, that we should not take advantage of that, because it's very real. So again, we're not minimizing that, and we're certainly not saying, oh, if you've got clinical depression or a diagnosable medical condition, just read the Bible and everything will be okay. No. That would be like saying, we believe God is the God of healing, but if you break your leg, just sit there and look at it and God will make it all better. Obviously, that won't happen. We need medical care to have that bone reset, and then maybe to get some pain medication, and to have a cast or a brace put on there, so the healing process that God has created will be allowed to happen properly. And so I'm kind of making a big deal about that, but I want to be very sure when we start talking about this idea of the blues that we aren't minimizing, once again, this idea of a genuine condition of depression. But that being said, the idea of the blues is something that probably all of us have come across. In our lesson today, this is something that I hadn't heard about, but they point out here that on January 18th of 2021, that's being called Blue Monday. You know, we've got Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all of those things, that these names that tend to come about. But evidently in recent years, Blue Monday has been identified as the third Monday in January. And the reason for that is because the Christmas season is past. Many people by this time have already failed in their New Year's resolutions. Sometimes people are starting to get those bills in the mail when you ran your credit card up to buy those Christmas presents. And I think what they're just saying is on average, by that third Monday in January, people may encounter the blues. Again, that's not clinical depression. That's just, oh boy, this kind of a sense of heaviness, a sense of something just weighing down on us. And certainly financial reasons and the passing of a celebrated season and the idea of us maybe failing or falling short on resolutions, all of those are things, very real things that can contribute to us sort of feeling down in the dumps and feeling this sense of the blues. And we have to understand that the scripture teaches us about these things. How do we deal with these, again, these up and down emotions? We need to do something a little bit more strong than just saying, stick to it, or keep a stiff upper lip, or, hey, you turn that frown upside down. There are some things that we can look at where we are taught to encourage ourselves and to rely upon the Lord. So that being said, we'll look very quickly at Psalm 31, a few verses from that particular book. Again, David is writing. We don't, as has been the case with many of the Psalms we've looked at in this series, we don't necessarily know for sure what was going on in David's life or when this particular Psalm was written. But most scholars tend to think that this was written at a time when David's son Absalom was threatening him and was wanting to take over his position as king. And so there was a time in David's life where he was under turmoil. Here is his son who was rebelling against him. If you've had a child that has rebelled against you, you may understand how that can be really bring a sense of, again, we're using that term depression, that sense of sadness, that sense of a heavy burden that just really gets us down. We don't feel like we want to move on to the next thing. Again, not a medical condition, but just the result of just the circumstances. And a rebellious child is one of those things. If you compare that, or even take that further with David, David knew that he was God's anointed. David knew that he was the one that was to be the king. And now here he's got a son that's trying to usurp his authority and really go against what God's plan was and what God's will would have been. And so for a lot of reasons, David might feel this idea of burden, this idea, maybe just see him sitting in his palace, or maybe just commiserating by himself and just thinking, boy, what do I do next? Where do I turn? And really kind of feeling this sense of burden and heaviness. And so if that's the case, and you can learn about that in 2 Samuel 17 and 18, kind of tells us the story of Absalom and his desire to take over the king's position from David and the struggles he may have gone through. So if indeed he did write that, use that as your context as we read through Psalm 31. So the first thing he writes in verses 1 and 2 is this: Lord, I seek refuge in you. Let me never be disgraced. Save me by your righteousness. Listen closely to me. Rescue me quickly. Be a rock of refuge for me, a mountain fortress to save me. And so, again, there are numerous ways out there that we can be encouraged to get through a tough day or a tough period. A lot of times, suggestions will come that we concentrate on other people. When you're feeling down, feeling the blues, maybe you volunteer, you serve somewhere, you help someone that may be less fortunate, and sometimes that helps us to put things in perspective. Sometimes it helps, again, just to sit and talk with someone, maybe not a professional counselor, but maybe just a friend, a trusted advisor, maybe someone you can pour your heart out to, and oftentimes even just verbalizing those things will help us feel a sense of relief. And sometimes, you might say, here's a rubber ball, just squeeze that for 5 minutes, or take a long walk, get some exercise, play with the dog for an hour. A lot of things we can do to kind of shape the blues and really kind of get rid of them and refocus ourselves. But here's one of the things that we can do, and as Christians we often overlook. It's really reminding ourselves that we truly can trust in God. Now here's where it's really important that we move away from this idea of just that Sunday school answer, yeah, trust in God and everything will be okay. But this is this idea of really in our hearts knowing and then applying this reality that God can be trusted. This is what David does. And listen to what he says when he says, I seek refuge in you. This idea of refuge would be like a city or a fortress or a harbor. Like if a ship is in a storm and he can and the ship's captain can find refuge or safe, calm waters in a harbor. If you are traveling and being pursued by enemies and you get to a city of refuge, as we see in the Old Testament, for example, you get within the walls of the fortress or the city. A safe place is what we're talking about with refuge, and that's what David was saying. Lord, I seek this safety, this protection that comes from you, from my relationship with you. And I wonder how many times we overlook that idea as Christians, that God really is our safe place, that there is that refuge that we have in him. And so, again, if we think about the things that are swirling around us, ask ourselves this question: is anything that is swimming around our lives, or anything that's impacting us at the current time, is any of that bigger than God? Is any of that something that God cannot offer us protection from? Now, again, God doesn't say, I'm just going to keep you from every kind of trial. But God does says, I will walk with you. I will surround you. I will see you through these difficult things. And again, it's that idea of never being alone. One of the simplest ways to become depressed is just to focus on your aloneness, to just look at self and just say, oh, I feel abandoned. I feel like nobody's loving me. Nobody cares. I feel like I can't achieve this relationship, or I just feel like I'm fighting these battles by myself. And for the Christian, that's a real easy temptation because we're part of this world, but we have to understand we're never, ever alone and separated from God. If we truly are his children, he loves us, he cares for us, he wants to be our refuge and our safe place. Remember how we talked earlier about maybe just talking to someone and just pouring out your heart to someone would make you feel better and maybe help lift you out of those doldrums. Why can't we do that with God? God is always there. We don't have to text him. We don't have to call and say, hey, can you meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop? We don't have to risk asking someone if they want to hear, and then maybe they're too busy or they're too bored with our story. None of that applies with God. He's always there to be a listening ear and for us to pour our hearts out to. And again, that sounds funny unless you really do understand that God is real. Unless you really understand that he truly does love you, that he cares for you, and that he does honestly want to offer comfort to you in any way that could be possible. And so David talks about this idea of he knows that God's his refuge. He knows that God is his salvation. He says to save me by your righteousness, and kind of that idea of looking around the world. And again, one of the things that leads us to depression is this sense of unrighteousness in the world. Things just aren't fair. Things aren't right. Things are corrupt. Things are all around me. Things are just not the way that I would want them to be going. And so even when we're fighting that, we need to understand that God's righteousness can overtake all of that. That God ultimately, the righteousness that we have, placing our faith and trust in the righteousness of Jesus Christ, will supersede all of that if we really do appropriate it and understand that and make that a part of our real life. Not just some, again, a Sunday school answer that we just fill in a blank properly, but we really do understand how do we do that. Understanding the reality of what David went through, and here he is doing just that, pouring out his heart before God, saying, this is what I need. I seek you as my refuge. I seek your righteousness. I seek that you, Lord, would make all of these things right. And I'm not even asking you how. I'm just saying, I know I need this. And so David is literally talking to the great counselor. He's talking to God and bringing his problems and concerns to him. And none of the things that David was worried about, even rebellion from his son Absalom, none of that is greater than God and the comfort that he offers. But listen, he moves on to verses 3 and 4. And he says this: for you are my rock and my fortress. You lead and guide me for your name's sake. You will free me from the net that is secretly set for me, for you are my refuge. And so it becomes this idea of moving from this statement that he says, I seek you as a refuge. I seek you as a fortress. But in verse 3, it's almost like David, again, reminds himself. He said, I seek you as a refuge, Lord. I seek your protection and your comfort. And then in verse 3, he says, for you are my rock and my fortress. And so you can almost see David's wheels turning as he writes these things. The first things he writes are, Lord, I need this from you. But then immediately following up with this knowledge, I know you are that for me. I know you're my rock and you're my fortress. And he reminds himself in this writing, God, he says, you lead and guide me for your name's sake. And that's a really important key to understand there, that God is not serving as a rock and a fortress for us for our name's sake. It's not to protect us. It's ultimately to see his own name glorified and lifted up. Imagine what testimony we have when we are brought out of depression, brought out of the doldrums, brought out of the blues, again, not clinical depression, but just brought out of the dumps, if you will. And you may be familiar with this idea of doldrums, which really comes from, it's a nautical term having to do with a boat with a sail out in the middle of a lake or ocean, and the wind dies down and there's nothing to propel the boat, and it just sort of floats there and drifts aimlessly until the wind kicks back up again. That's where we get the idea of the doldrums. And so we need to understand that it's God that is the wind beneath our sails. God is the one that can bring us out of these doldrums, and he's saying that he does that for his name's sake. We can glorify God when we're brought out of that pit of misery, when our focus is sharpened, and when we redeem and reclaim the joy that we have, and we know that the circumstances around us are not bigger than him. Ultimately, all of that is for his name's sake. And he talks about this idea again. He knows in advance that he will be freed. It doesn't say what the timeline on this is. He said, you will free me for the net that is secretly set for me. The idea of secretly set is that of a trap. A hunter might set a trap. And so he might even be saying, I don't know where the net is. I don't know when it's coming. I don't know where it's coming from. But I know that you will free me from it. Even if I get ensnared in it, God, you will free me. And you notice he doesn't say, you will free me from the net in the next hour, or you will free me from that net in the next day or month. There's no timeline, but it's this bigger idea that he says, it doesn't matter what's coming around me. I know in the end, for God's glory, he will set me free. And why? Because again, you are my refuge. And again, the idea of refuge does not mean that God is going to protect us from everything. It means that he is that place that we can go to, especially at an emotional level, when we're feeling pressed in upon, where we're feeling discouraged, where we're feeling depressed and feeling the blues. We can turn to him. And in fact, I would say not only we can turn to him, I would say that as believers, we should be turning to him. He ought to be the first and foremost avenue, is bringing our cares and concerns before the Lord. And this does not require us to be perfect. This does not require us to say, well, do I deserve to do all this? David himself didn't deserve all that. If we look at it from a human perspective, he was a sinner through and through. He committed some grievous errors and mistakes in his life, maybe some errors that are far more greater than anything you've ever committed. And yet he understood that his refuge was found in God. Imagine if he had turned to God as his refuge during a period of temptation with Bathsheba, or during a period of temptation when he wanted to put Uriah, her husband, to death. What if he had turned to God as his refuge during that trying time? And again, it's that idea of our lives turn out a whole lot better when we place our faith and trust in God, and we understand that he truly can sustain us. And it's the same with the depression. It's the same with the blues, with these down times. It's understanding that he's bigger than our circumstances. We bring those things openly and honestly before the Lord. And so then we move on to verses 5 through 8 as we wrap this up. He says, into your hand I entrust my spirit. That's such an important line there. You have redeemed me, Lord God of truth. Again, reminding himself. And if I would advise you maybe to journal. Some of the college courses I teach on spiritual disciplines have to do with journaling. And sometimes that idea of just pouring out your heart before the Lord in prayer, certainly bringing that in a spoken word or a thought word as you pray to the Lord. But if you write those things down and pen those things, you almost get the idea of David almost journaling here. He's reminding himself, you have redeemed me, Lord God of truth. He says, I hate those who are devoted to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. He's drawing that contrast between what can be depended on and what can't. I will rejoice and be glad in your faithful love because you have seen my affliction. Again, there's no timeline on that, but he's saying there will come a day when, because you have been faithful to me, I will rejoice. He acknowledges that God sees his affliction. God knows everything that David's going through, and he knows that victory will come to him at some point. You know the troubles of my soul. What a comforting line there, that God knows the troubles of our soul. And yet he says in verse 8, you have not handed me over to the enemy. You have set my feet in a spacious place. So many words of encouragement and comfort there. But let's go back to that first one in verse 5. Into your hand I entrust my spirit. That's such a profound concept of really saying that our totality of our being is given over, sacrificially surrendered to God. All that is within us, that's what's meant by God, your will, your way. You have my life, and everything that I am, I'm handing it over to you. And into your hands I commend, or I commit my spirit. And and there's so much to be grateful for. We talked about the seeing the affliction, knowing the troubles of the soul, not handed over the enemy. You've given me freedom to roam. You put my feet in a spacious place. All of that comes about when we truly do entrust our lives into and our spirits into God's hands. Look back in Luke 23, verse 46, when Jesus said this. He was crucified on the cross, and the last thing he said before he died, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. Now think about that. You talk about a reason maybe to be depressed or have the blues or to be down. Jesus was in the process of being crucified and was in fact at the very end of that particular multiple hour journey of agony, the pain and the being right near the point of death. And the last recorded words that we see is, even then he said, into your hand I entrust my spirit. Everything about it was, God, you're in charge, your will, your way. And from a human perspective, we wrestle through this when we think about it theologically, but from a human perspective, what part of Jesus would have wanted to be crucified? What part of him would have found great joy in nails being driven into his hands and feet, to be hung on that cross naked and in shame and in pain, blood pouring out of him, the crown of thorns, the spear thrust in his side, just the idea of up and down on the cross in agony, trying to strain for breath and dying by slow asphyxiation and blood loss, and all of that we consider with the cross. Who wouldn't have been depressed? Who wouldn't have been feeling the blues? I mean, that would be a massive case of really an opportunity to feel sorry for yourself and feel like all is lost. But Jesus understood even then all was lost for that particular chapter in his life, but that was necessary for what was going to come. And he said, God, even now, into your hands I entrust my spirit. If Jesus could have that attitude on the cross, fulfilling what God wanted him to do, even though it was painful and didn't, I know it made sense to Jesus, but from a human perspective, that's a hard thing to wrestle with and to comprehend. Certainly we can say, God, you're bigger than anything I'm going through. Yeah, I've got the blues, normal part of life, the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, the good fortune, the bad fortune, the health, the illness. We talk about that in our marriage vows, in sickness and in health, and for richer or poor. We understand going into life that there's going to be ups and downs, and certainly some of those things can beat us up. Some of those things can cause us to be, again, depressed, to just feel sad, down in the dumps, or just, again, think that case of the blues. And yet God said, trust in me. Would you be reminded that I truly am in control? Would it help you to do what David did, to write down some things, to share your struggles with God, to include that in your prayers to him, and be open and honest? He understands the troubles of your soul, as David wrote here. So why don't we just say, God, here's the troubles in my soul. I know you know this, but here's what's really bringing me down, and begin to process through that. Now, I will say again, if there's any part of you that really senses that this is a clinical issue, that there's a medical diagnosis that could happen, if this has been a long, ongoing process, if this is less related to specific circumstances, say for example the passing of a loved one, perfectly normal to maybe feel the blues as part of that grieving process that we talked about in our first lesson. But maybe you're sort of past that a little bit, and yet you still can't shake some of these blues, and that's all part of it. It's all part of life. But if you've been on a really elongated journey where you can't seem to shake the blues, when you've got serious depression, when even the happiest times around you can't find joy, then I would encourage you, please find some medical help. Find a Christian counselor who can walk you through some of those things at a deeper level. But that's not all of us. But I would say all of us have been through times where those ups and downs just kind of get the better of us. And so I would encourage you, if that's a real issue, please find some help and call the church office. We can get you connected with somebody. Or if you need to get a medical diagnosis, please don't hesitate to talk to a physician about those sorts of things and find out what some steps would be. But for the rest of us, let's never forget that we can entrust our hearts and our lives and our spirits into God's hands. He truly cares for us. And isn't it going to be a great day when we're in his presence for eternity and there will be no more depression? There'll be no grieving. There'll be no more sadness. There will be no more of these ups and downs. Our journey with him during this time is just a small inkling or taste of what it's going to be in eternity, and all of that other stuff is going to be gone. So maybe just holding on to that thought of eternity will get you through some of these more difficult and challenging times of the blues. So I hope that's at least been a little bit of a blessing to you. And again, contact the church office if you would love to talk with me or one of the other pastors about some of those things. We would certainly love to engage in those conversations with you. Well, hope you had a good Christmas and a New Year's. We did send an email out recently that says starting this Sunday, at least for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be worshiping back on campus. But remember, we won't have any nursery or kids church. We're going to have a couple more weeks to let some of those small groups just kind of come back more slowly. But we will be worshiping on campus, and so you can certainly tune in online. But if you want to come and worship with us at 10:30, we would love to see you here on campus worshiping with us in person. We miss you when you're not here, and there will be a day. Maybe you're feeling in the blues and depressed because we haven't been able to worship and gather. Maybe that's a little frustrating for you, but would you just give that over to God? Would you surrender that to the Lord and just say, Lord, one day this is going to happen. We're going to be back together. I'm going to be connecting with my Bible fellowship class. I'm going to be worshiping with my family here at Chilhowie Hills, and we're going to be doing that together. That day will come, I promise you. And so stick with us, be patient, pray with us, and again, we're here to talk if you have any of those needs that you want to be brought up. So hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. We look forward to seeing you on Sunday morning, and God bless. Thanks for tuning in.